Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this public discussion with Raz Segal on the question of genocide in Gaza. My name is Nader Hashemi. I teach Middle East politics at Georgetown University. And at the outset, I just want to reiterate what Laurie said a moment ago, that this event tonight is not sponsored by Georgetown University, but rather by 3 academic units at Georgetown University, specifically African Studies, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. In response to events of October the 7th and the current war in Gaza, we've organized at Georgetown a lecture series on this particular topic. Our first lecture begins tomorrow, and it's with Professor Raz Segal, who I'll introduce in a moment. And we thought that as we bring in these lecturers to speak about Gaza at Georgetown, what we would like to do is reach out to a different, perhaps, segments of the Washington, D.C. community and have them come to a place like Busboys and Poets and have a public conversation very much about this global crisis that we're all concerned about and where the United States is very much implicated in. You can find out more about this lecture series by going to our website. We're bringing in 4 lectures, one roughly every month going forward during the spring semester. And so I want to begin also by thanking Busboys and Poets for partnering with us. It's great to be here tonight, and we appreciate your support very much. The format is, has already been sort of discussed. Raz Segal and I are going to have a public conversation for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn the floor over to all of you, because I suspect there's going to be a lot of questions, comments, and hopefully some dissenting points of view as well. Dr. Raz Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies with an endowed professorship in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University. Dr. Segal has held numerous prestigious fellowships, including most recently a senior fellowship at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. He's the author of numerous publications. I won't list them all, but they were in the advertised programming for tonight. Since we're at a bookstore, I do want to mention that he's working on 2 book projects. One that deals with a critical account of the broad theme of history, memory, and Holocaust bystanders, and a second book that offers a new analysis of Israeli mass violence from the 1948 Nakba to the current Israeli assault on Gaza. He's also a public intellectual. He's written for The Guardian, the LA Times, The Nation, Jewish Currents, Haaretz, plus 972 magazine, and he's appeared on Democracy Now! And ABC News. Why Raz Segal? Because if you're following this debate in the question of genocide, Raz Segal has really been, in my view, the most forceful advocate among genocide scholars that what is taking place today in Gaza is a violation by Israel of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. And thus I thought it would be good to bring him here to make the argument, to entertain questions. Of course, the timing of this could not be more perfect, because if you're following what's happening internationally, tomorrow at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, this topic will be discussed among the jurists as South Africa brings an application to the court. And then finally, the reason for doing this is, of course, this is Washington, D.C., and we're in the nation's capital, and the United States is very much involved, and I would argue personally implicated in the horrors that we've been seeing since October the 7th. So let me begin by turning to Raz and say, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Nader, and thank you for the organizers and for Busboys and Poets here. I can't say I'm very happy to be here because of the circumstances of this event, but thank you all for coming and looking forward to the discussion.
So, Raz, before we get into the question of genocide in Gaza, could you give us a sense of your own background? How did you get involved in the whole question of genocide studies? Who has informed you intellectually in this broad area? Give us some of that sort of background information that brings you to this subject.
Well, I mean, there's a couple ways to answer this, and I'll be very brief in what I say. My grandparents are Holocaust survivors. Were Holocaust survivors from Romania and Bulgaria, so much less known actually cases publicly, histories of the Holocaust. So I had this kind of interest about the Holocaust from this family background. I didn't really know anything until I actually went to do a master's degree in Jewish history in Tel Aviv University. But this is part of the background that brought me into this. But actually, what really got me interested, not only in the Holocaust, but more broadly in genocide, was in a trip in India, in the city of Udaipur, southern Rajasthan. I stumbled into a bookstore, like you do when you travel around, I didn't have any specific aim or goal. You know, I was just walking around. It's a very interesting city, Udaipur. I stumbled into a bookstore and I encountered an essay. It was a booklet that was an essay by Arundhati Roy. I hadn't heard of her at the time at all. It was The Greater Common Good, an essay about megadam projects in India, one specific megadam project in India, and the violence and forced displacement and really genocidal destruction of indigenous groups in the process of megadam construction, again with the focus on the Salo Sarovar megadam project in India. And as I was, you know, this is, again, together with this personal family background that I had, these two things together really, I would say, pushed me to start to pursue this academically. So when I came back from this trip, at the time I came back to Israel, then I decided that I'm going to pursue this. So I went to do a degree, what seemed to me at the time very logical, a master's degree in Jewish history. And from there, develop further. But that's the kind of, these are the things that brought me into this study of Holocaust and genocide studies.
So genocide scholars are divided now over the question of whether that concept and that violation of the UN Convention applies to the current status of what's happening in Gaza. You've been involved in these debates, organizing it, you're on one side of that debate. Could you give us a broad sort of landscape of what the different sort of constituencies are, or categories or groups are among genocide scholars with respect to Gaza today?
Yeah, so I mean, these two ways in which I entered the field, my family background, and obviously also growing up in Israel, so this kind of Holocaust framework, right? But then also Arundhati Roy's essay and a much more genocide framework. And that's, unfortunately the field has been divided in this way for a long time, Holocaust and genocide. Even though it's called Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which also tells us something about this divide. But now, since 7th of October, this divide has really blown up. And unfortunately, again, we see it along these lines. So in November, there was a statement that was put together primarily by Holocaust scholars about 7th of October and about Gaza. And last time I checked, it's a kind of Google doc, so people continue adding their names, but there was about 150 names, primarily Holocaust scholars, a lot of them obscure names, but there's some very significant names in the field who signed to that statement, including, for example, Professor Zal Friedlander and others. That statement was actually very shocking to me, I think to many others. There was no mention whatsoever, this is November, right? No mention whatsoever of any kind of Israeli crime in that statement. And it really partook in this dehumanization of Palestinians in the sense that the only way in which they're mentioned is as human shields. And everything that happens, basically the destruction and the killing in Gaza is only the fault of Hamas. And that's the context in which Palestinians are mentioned as human shields. So that was, and again, I've been working in this field for quite some time, and I was still actually shocked of this statement. Again, no mention whatsoever of any Israeli crime, nothing, right? So we decided, a group of scholars, to put together a statement, partly in response to that, but really more a statement more broadly in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. And again, we also have in this, so it's 60 scholars that signed on to our statement. It was published eventually on 9th of December and published in Contending Modernities and was circulated. And among our group, there's some, again, some very influential people who have shaped the field for a long time. And of course, in our statement, we dealt both with the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October and with, of course, the Israeli assault on Gaza. So in these two statements, when you compare them, when you think about them, right, again, one, primarily Holocaust scholars, the other, much more broadly, people who deal with also the Holocaust, but genocide, mass violence, human rights, and other related issues and questions, really gives you a sense of the divide. But I would really say that the field today, and again, we can call it Holocaust and Genocide Studies, is in real crisis today, right? Because, and that's the last thing I'll say about this, in the field, Israel has impunity in the international legal system. We might talk about this a bit more, really since the international legal system reemerged after World War II. But in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Israel also has this kind of impunity, we might say, but an exceptional status, right? And a lot of scholars in the field, you know, were very comfortable with this exceptional status, that we can basically, we can all see decades of crude Israeli mass violence, of occupation, of a settlement project, of, you know, mass internment, of attack on Palestinian children and youth, and we can treat it in an exceptional way, basically. And now I think there's a clear crisis. So there are scholars who are still very comfortable with this exceptional status, right? But there are a lot of scholars now who are very clear on the fact that business as usual in Holocaust and Genocide Studies is not possible anymore moving forward. So it is a watershed moment in many ways, and again, we might talk about this, but it's also a watershed moment in Holocaust and Genocide Studies.
Okay, so the US government has described the South African case against Israel at the International Court of Justice as, quote, meritless, counterproductive, and completely without basis in fact whatsoever. The Israeli government has responded to the South African application by calling it a blood libel. So I want to play devil's advocate here for a moment and lay out the argument that I think represents the US position and the Israeli position on this topic and get you to respond. And take as much time as you want in your response. So I think the counter response to the position that you have is the following. The UN Genocide Convention defines genocide as an act committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The argument goes, nothing like that is happening in Gaza today. Israel's campaign is intended to destroy Hamas, not the Palestinian people. And unlike Hamas, which set out deliberately to kill civilians on October the 7th, Israel has been trying to avoid civilian harm. Now you can argue it isn't trying to do that hard enough, that its campaign has been indiscriminate, reckless, or even brutal, and that there have been innocent people killed. No doubt about that, but intentions profoundly matter when it comes to making moral judgments, the argument goes. In domestic criminal law, we differentiate between a premeditated killing and an accidental death. Thus, there is a world of difference between a democratic state defending itself against terrorism and a movement that storms a music festival and guns down throngs of innocent people at close range. Thus, the charge of genocide against Israel is not only factually wrong, but it's deeply misleading and malicious. That's the position that we hear, I think, basically from the US government, from the Israeli government and their supporters. How do you respond?
Well, you know, we can put this just as a sidebar. I would actually argue against the fact that Israel has ever been really a democracy. But we can put this aside and, you know, maybe address it later. But just because you mentioned it in the kind of narrative. But look, genocide. It's important to say that in international law there is no hierarchy, contrary to the kind of popular perception that there is a hierarchy. And indeed, you know, there is this idea that genocide is the crime of crimes, right? So it obviously suggests a hierarchy, but there is no hierarchy. There's different crimes with different elements, right? And obviously, when you also look at the perspective of the victims, right, of state violence, of mass violence, of different crimes in international law, and of course, for victims, it really doesn't matter, right? In many ways, if the suffering and the attack against them is categorized as a crime against humanity, or a war crime, or genocide. So there's, now, why am I saying this? Because it's not that it's not significant to talk about different kinds of crimes, but we need to talk about the elements that define these different crimes. Now, genocide does have very specific elements that differentiate it, right? It doesn't have to be in a hierarchy, from other crimes in international law. And one of the main ones, of course, is intent, right? You have to demonstrate intent to destroy in the language of the UN Genocide Convention from 1948. There's a couple other things, by the way, that differentiate genocide from other crimes in international law. There is the legal obligation to intervene to stop genocide, which we don't have in other crimes, so Article 1 in the Convention, right? Article 2 defines genocide and mentions the issue of intent. Article 1, the obligation to intervene and to stop genocide, which is part of the context of the South Africa application to the International Court of Justice, right? Part of the background is this legal obligation to intervene, to stop, and to prevent genocide. And then there's also the issue of incitement. Whoops. The issue of incitement in Article 3, which is a separate crime, but also differentiates genocide from other crimes in international law. So let's start with the most, the two elements of genocide, the intent to destroy, and, thank you, the intent to destroy and the dynamics of violence themselves. The intent to destroy is usually very difficult to prove and to demonstrate. And that's why we don't have actually a lot of cases that are recognized as genocide since 1948, right? You can think about Rwanda in 1994, in all the mass violence in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s, only the Srebrenica massacre is recognized as an act of genocide. There's very few cases that are recognized as genocide because intent, indeed, is very difficult to prove. Why? Because perpetrators usually don't walk around expressing their intent openly, directly, in such an unashamed way as we see now in Israel's assault on Gaza. So one of the first things to say, and I'll say a few things about the dynamics of violence as well, which is of course very important because you need both of them, right? Just expressions of intent still don't make genocide. And by the way, you can have mass murder that is not genocidal, right? And you can actually have genocide without systematic mass murder at all, right? But let's start with intent. Intent is very important. So is people with command authority, this kind of term in international law, so state leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers, right? People with command authority, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about intent. Other politicians, ministers, journalists, other public figures, right? That falls much more within incitement, right? So we can talk a bit about that as well. But people with command authority have been making, since the 7th of October until today, over time, right? This was not only at the heat of the moment, this was not only in the week or 10 days after 7th of October, right? Since the 7th of October until today, over time, have been making explicit, direct, clear, and unashamed statements of genocidal intent to destroy, right? There are dozens and dozens of these statements by people with command authority. I urge you to take a look. Law for Palestine has, about a week ago, posted the database that they've been collecting. They've actually been collecting now, there's about 500 statements that have to do with genocide since 7th of October that they've been collecting, so incitement and intent, politicians, state leaders, army officers, public figures, journalists, right? It's now published on their website, Law for Palestine, and it's different categories, so you can go online and take a look. But it's important to say that these statements, again, dozens of statements over time, right? And they've been using various kinds of different mechanisms, right? Both to portray, for example, Palestinians in Gaza as a whole, as enemies, which is a very typical genocidal view, right? A group of civilians as a whole as an enemy. We can think about the Armenian genocide, for example, when all the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were viewed by Ottoman authorities as enemies, that is, as basically as agents of the Russian enemy, right? So actually the most dangerous enemies within. That's the basis on which we have the Armenian genocide during World War I. And we can think in this case, in the Israeli case, about, again, all this is well known. Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog on 10th of October in a press conference saying outright, explicitly, that all the people in Gaza, 2.3 million people, half of whom are under the age of 18, are all responsible, as he said, quote unquote, for the Hamas-led attack on the 7th of October, right? So again, portraying all the people, all the Palestinians in Gaza as enemies, as legitimate military targets. This is one way in which we see the mechanisms of genocidal intent expressed. But one of the main ways in which genocidal intent is expressed that I want to stress here is actually in religious language. And this is very, so I'm obviously talking again, all this is also, again, I want to stress, so well known at this point, right? Because it was expressed clearly, explicitly in an unashamed way. So when I say religious language, I'm referring specifically to the Amalek reference, so the portrayal of Palestinians in Gaza as the biblical people of Amalek. It's important to state here, right, that the story, the biblical story of Amalek is not open to multiple interpretations. It is a story about a people as a whole that are portrayed as enemies of the Israelites, the Jews, and should be as a whole, society and culture, Amalek should be destroyed, must be destroyed, right? As the worst enemy, right? As the ultimate evil. Now, Netanyahu, of course, used the reference to Amalek as Israel was beginning its ground invasion at the end of 29th of October, and then repeated it, right, in a special letter to soldiers and officers in the Israeli army in early November, and we have other references to Amalek, you know, again, other expressions of intent or incitement to genocide that use Amalek. Now, the reference to Amalek is very important because even if, right, even if it would be said that this applies only to Hamas, right, it's still a genocidal reference because, again, the biblical story places the whole people of Amalek, right, civilians, competents, not in our terms, right, as an enemy, right, as a group that must be destroyed, right? So this is very important. It works also, with references to Palestinians as evil, right, so evil again, I'm raising evil here as a religious term, right, that we've been hearing since the 7th of October. And it works also with references to Israel's attack as seen as a struggle of the people of light against the people of darkness, which is again a statement that Netanyahu has made a number of times and other Israeli leaders, also in the context of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah just recently. So all these kinds of religious references, right, portraying Palestinians as evil, portraying Palestinians as Amalek, portraying Palestinians as responsible as a whole for the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October. All these, each and every one of them in itself is very troubling. All of them taken together over time, right, expressed by different people, and with extremely dehumanizing language, right? We can think, again, all of this is so very well known, right? So, and that's why, by the way, the reason that Israel is going to have a very, very difficult time this week, right? Arguing that all these dozens of statements of intent that we have and the dehumanizing language is not actually what it is, genocidal intent, right? So I'm really looking forward to seeing how they try to do this, right? Israel in the ICJ case, because intent is going to be actually at the forefront, right? Intent is very, very crucial for the crime of genocide. So I just want to complete the issue of the dehumanizing language. We've heard human animals, right, in Israel Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's total siege proclamation on 9th of October, right? We've heard descriptions of Palestinians by Netanyahu again, but also by others as monsters, right? So human animal monsters. But we've also heard dehumanization that uses this particularly crude weaponization of the Holocaust, the portrayal of Palestinians as Nazis, right? The portrayal of Palestinians as Nazis, and this is, of course, a world turned upside down, right? This takes the victims of a genocidal assault and now not only portrays them as perpetrators, but again, as the ultimate perpetrators, the case that's perceived, that's seen as the ultimate evil, right, in genocide, right, Nazis. So we've also heard this, again, from the 12th of October, from this infamous interview of former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett on 12th of October in Sky News, where he just said, quote, "We are fighting Nazis," right? And then, again, Netanyahu's reference to, in this case, specifically to the Hamas, right, as the new Nazis, but again, Nazis here functions very much like Amalek. So even when it's applied only to Hamas, it has a genocidal meaning, right, in that sense, because if we're fighting Nazis, there are no law applies, there are no rules, there are no restrictions, right? You can really do anything in the fight against Nazis. That's definitely a popular perception, certainly in Israel, among Israelis, right? But there's also then references to Palestinians and Nazis, not only to Hamas. So in early November, for example, there was a senior Israeli leader, it's not clear who it was, was most likely Netanyahu himself, who talked about the need to denazify, that after the war, there would be a need to denazify Gaza, right? So again, thinking about Palestinians and Nazis in a broader sense than just Hamas as Nazis. So if we think about intent, right, I think that the case is absolutely clear, right, that we have here explicit and unashamed genocidal intent. Now, the question could be asked, and it's important to address, why do we have this? Why are Israelis actually doing what perpetrators of genocide rarely do? And the answer, I think, to me, is very clear. The Israelis are imagining this attack in the frame of colonial warfare, right? I mean, Israel is a settler colonial state from the beginning. Israel is a settler project, and Israel, therefore, thinking in colonial terms is something that happens in Israel politics society a lot in any case. But here, Israel is very much thinking, Israel and Israelis, in the very similar to the way that colonial occupiers and powers thought about putting down rebellions of colonized people. And we can think about German Southwest Africa and the genocide of the Herero and Hama in 1904 to 1907, where indeed the German general in charge, once the Herero rebelled in 1904, and actually killed German settlers and civilians, right? The German commander on the ground, General von Trotha, issued a, quote, extermination order, right? Very explicit extermination order, and then within a couple of years, by 1907, destroyed in various ways almost the entire Herero group, in addition to 10,000 of the Nama, right? So Israelis are now imagining that they are fighting against savages, right? So savages in the colonial sense. So therefore, Amalek, evil, people of darkness, Nazis, everything is permitted in this struggle, and therefore it's also absolutely natural to express themselves in this way, right? There's no problem with it whatsoever, and that's why we're seeing these expressions of intent. Only now, by the way, with the ICJ case, only now, right, in the 4th month of this genocidal assault, right, with all the dynamics of violence that we'll turn to in a second, we're starting to see Israelis, including Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, start to a big backtrack, but it's way too late now, right, with all these dozens of statements out there, right? So the issue of intent, we're very clear. The dynamics of violence, look, there's, you know, again, everything is well known, right? About 23,000 Palestinians killed in this attack so far. More than 7,000 missing, buried under the rubble, most probably dead. So we're talking about more than 30,000 Palestinians killed so far in this attack, about 60,000 injured, some of them very badly injured. 2 million Palestinians, virtually almost the entire Palestinian population of Gaza, forcibly displaced. We know that the total siege proclamation, right, of 9th of October that I mentioned, did what it was supposed to do. We have now hunger conditions, we have unbelievable overcrowding in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, and we already have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are sick with infectious diseases, and the further outbreak of infectious diseases, we know now because various experts around the world are telling us, right, that 500,000 Palestinians might die in the coming year from infectious disease and hunger if this attack doesn't stop, right? So the total siege proclamation, no food, no water, no fuel, no medical supplies, right, did what it was supposed to do. Now, but I want to just concentrate just for a couple minutes and then we can move on with one particular issue of the dynamics of violence. Again, very early on, that already very early on showed us the genocidal intent, and that's actually the evacuation order of 12th and 13th of October, right? When Israel ordered more than 1 million people from the northern part of the Gaza Strip to evacuate to the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Now, why was that already in itself genocidal? Because it was done under conditions of carpet bombing of Gaza, right? And under condition of total siege. And we know today Palestinians were sending out of Gaza from the 7th of October text messages and WhatsApp messages and voice messages. And we know today from these messages, and some of them have been published online and accessible, we know that by 13th of October, with this evacuation order, they were already feeling very much, obviously the bombings themselves, but also the impact of the total siege, right? So see the food shortages, clean water shortages, shortages of medical supplies, and so the evacuation order, right, was actually meant, there's, in the Genocide Convention, we have the intent to destroy, and we have 5 acts of genocide. Killing members of a group, causing serious bodily mental harm, deliberately creating conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part. That's the evacuation order, right? The evacuation order, under conditions of bombing and a total siege, right, was deliberately creating conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group. Also because we know that as Palestinians were fleeing south, Israel was bombing them on routes that it designated as allegedly safe. And even the New York Times published a big investigation on how Israel used its most powerful and destructive bombs in bombing in the south, right, where it had told Palestinians to flee. And we know from these messages that Palestinians were sending outside of Gaza from the 7th of October that actually quite a lot of Palestinians fled south, were bombed in these massive bombing campaigns, and if they survived, they returned to the north, right? Because they thought that they had better chances to survive in the north, right? So it's not only that the evacuation order, right, fits deliberately creating conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group. Also think about the very many people, right? Pregnant women, people in hospitals, people defined as disabled in various ways, who just can't flee in these conditions, right? But they were bombed on the way, and Israel was putting a total siege on the Gaza Strip as it was happening. So this already was absolutely genocidal in its dynamics. And of course, this is exactly what happened, right? So as I said, we have acute hunger. We have infectious diseases, right? We have massive number of people killed in these bombings, right? We have everything that Israel intended to create, right, in the evacuation order. And of course, then people fled to the south, and once Israel turned to its military operations in the south, and it ordered people to flee in these ever-shrinking areas that were never safe, because there is no safe place in a genocidal attack, right? So the evacuation order on 13th of October, at that early stage, already we had clear indications, together with the language of intent, of course, right, which is very important, that this is indeed, right, as I wrote on 13th of October, a textbook case of genocide.
Let me push back a little bit on you. If Israel is guilty of the crime of genocide against the Palestinians, how do you explain the 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and who are not subjected to the conditions that you just described? Doesn't that undermine your case? Because if Israel is out to get all Palestinians, we have at least 2 million in Israel that, okay, they're citizens, they're maybe second-class citizens, but they're not victims of genocide. So how would you respond to that argument?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's something very important to explain about genocide, is that it's a process, right? Now, there is a key misconception about genocide in the public, right? And not only in the public, I mean, it's a lot. Most people think that genocide, right, is killing all the members of the targeted group as fast as possible, right? That's not genocide. This misconception, by the way, is based on another misconception, which is that's what the Holocaust was, right? Because a lot of the thinking, the popular thinking about genocide is that it's supposed to look like the Holocaust, and the Holocaust was the Nazis killing all the Jews very fast. No, it took the Nazis 2.5 years, 2.5 years into the war, from the fall of 1939 into the spring of 1942, right? In an attack against the Jews that was very deadly, right? It killed hundreds of thousands of people until the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, and after that in the mass shooting campaigns. But it mostly concentrated until the invasion of the Soviet Union, right? So for 2 years, on forced displacement, on getting as many Jews as possible out of the expanding German territory. And as these policies radicalized and actually failed, the Germans were failing in these forced displacement, what we call today ethnic cleansing, right? Eventually, it took them 2.5 years until they reached the final version of what they call the final solution of the Jewish question. That is, to murder every Jew within German reach. And once they reached that in the early spring of 1942, within less than a year, almost all the Jews within German reach were dead, right? But it takes 2.5 years into the war in this process, right? Genocide is a process, right? Killing members of the group, as I said, is one of the acts of genocide in the convention, right? But it's not the only case, and as I said, we can actually have genocide without mass murder at all, right? So genocide is a process. Why is this relevant to what you asked? Because this is another way in which we need to consider the issue of genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza and take very seriously the issue of prevention, right? So the convention is the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So there's punishment, accountability, and there's also prevention, and there's the legal obligation in Article 1 to stop, right, an ongoing genocide, right, which we're now, as I said, the basis for the South Africa application to the ICJ. But Israel's society today, and here I'm coming to the 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? Israel's society today is awash in genocidal language. That's the issue of incitement. From the 7th of October, again, unashamed because of this imagination, right, that this is basically colonial warfare, right? Remember, by the way, right, that international law emerges, the history of international law is that it emerges in the West as a law that regulates wars between, quote, civilized nations, that is Europeans, right? International law doesn't apply to colonial wars, where it's wars against savages, right? And that's why we also have unbelievable, vicious incitement in Israel. Again, all this is very well known. Again, Law for Palestine has collected this and now has started to publish it on their website, so I urge you to take a look. But calls in Israel politics and media, journalists in public spaces to flatten Gaza, to destroy Gaza, calls for a second Nakba, right, referring to the 1948 Nakba, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, the massacres and the killing of 50,000 Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of villages and towns in the 1948 war when Israel was created. Posters on the bridges in the Tel Aviv highway, right, saying explicitly that the image of victory is 0 people in Gaza, right? You don't need a degree in comparative literature to interpret this, right? And again, you know, we can spend so much time, but it's all out there. It's all so clear, and that's why, you know, the part of the South African application to the International Court of Justice is about the issue of incitement to genocide in Israel politics and society, and how Israel has done 0 to try to stop it and prevent it, right? Or, of course, to hold those who are inciting to genocide accountable, including ministers in the government, right, who are not part of the war effort. So why is all this important? Because the 2 million, almost 1.8 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, right, they're in acute danger today, if we consider genocide as a process, right? Because the incitement now it's very much focused on Palestinians in Gaza. But if we look at the history of Israel, Israeli Palestinians, the 156,000 Palestinians who had survived the Nakba and remained in what became Israel in 1948, they were immediately put under military rule for 20 years, until 1966. Why is this important? Because the state and society immediately saw them as enemies, right? As enemies, or as potential enemies. Now, we can think also, so we can fast forward now, just to some key things in the last few years. The 2018 Jewish nation state law. Israel doesn't have a constitution, right? So basic laws replace a constitution. In 2018, Israel enacted a new basic law, the Jewish nation state law, which is an explicitly racist settler colonial law that says that Palestinians are actually second-class citizens, right? And they don't deserve self-determination in their homeland, right? Now, May 2021, okay, May 2021, I don't know if you remember, another Israeli assault on Gaza, but also an assault on the Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, right? It was the first time in a long time that Israeli Palestinians came out to protest, right, and to show solidarity. And there's family connections between Israeli Palestinians and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, of course, and there's all kinds of other connections, obviously, right? I mean, the fracturing of Palestinians is itself an Israeli settler colonial project, right? So Israeli Palestinians in May 21 came out to protest and to support these attacks, and the response of the Israeli state and police was particularly vicious, particularly violent, but this time Jewish citizens joined the Israeli police in attacking Palestinian citizens, and in some places, like in the northern city of Haifa, the police and Jewish citizens broke into the homes of Palestinians and attacked them in their homes, right? In many places, particularly in Haifa. Why am I mentioning all of this? Because this is, so we have the view of Palestinian Israelis as enemies from the beginning of the state. We have recent events, and there's many more that we can talk about, right? But I just mentioned a few important issues, right? Palestinian Israelis today have retreated to their homes, retreated to their communities. They're very, very fearful, and for good reason, because Israeli politics and society is awash in genocidal language today, right? The fact that, and there was, by the way, a significant attack. There's thousands of arrests, also of Israeli Palestinians, right? the settler minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, right, who's the minister of internal security in Israel, explicit settler, right, has actually distributed thousands of weapons in Israel, also in the West Bank, but in Israel, and set up hundreds of new, quote, self-defense units. Israeli Palestinians today actually find themselves in the position, for example, of Armenians in the Armenian genocide, so the enemy within, the most dangerous perception of the enemy, right? They're citizens, right? They are in a similar situation to Tutsis in Rwanda, who the state, the Hutu-controlled state in 1990, associated directly with the Tutsi, the Rwanda Patriotic Front, the Tutsi militia who invaded Rwanda from Uganda in 1990 and began a war that culminated in the Rwanda genocide in 1994, right? The mass murder of 800,000 Tutsi and their Hutu supporters within 3 months in 1994, because Tutsi were viewed, again, as the most dangerous enemy, the enemy within, with a lot, of course, dehumanizing language. Also in the Rwanda media. There was a media case in the post-genocide trials in Rwanda, the ICTR, right, where 3 journalists were convicted of incitement for genocide. There are dozens of Israeli journalists today who could stand trial for incitement to genocide. And so Israeli Palestinians are in acute danger, which is another reason that the ICJ South Africa application is so important, right, in hopefully finally bringing a stop and end to the Israeli attack, because with every day that it continues, and also the threat of a regional conflict that Israel is making a lot of effort to create, by the way, right, puts Palestinian danger in more and more, Palestinian Israelis in more and more danger, which is, as I said, another reason to highlight the framework of genocide in this case.
Okay, one final question, and we'll turn it over to the audience. In the abstract that you sent me for your talk tomorrow at Georgetown, you sort of indicated or suggested that this moment of trauma, of crisis, of horror could be a transformative moment in terms of Israeli-Palestinian relations that might open the door to some sort of future settlement where Israelis and Palestinians can live in equality, or there might be a silver lining out of this traumatic moment that we're seeing right now in Gaza and in Israel. I might be misreading your abstract, but in the car ride you sort of implied that there was perhaps something to be optimistic about down the road. I don't see any room for optimism. Could you make a case for why this moment that we're going through might open potential doors for a just resolution of this crisis and this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians?
Yeah, I didn't mention in the abstract specifically relations between Israelis and Palestinians. I don't think I did. But and I wouldn't say a silver lining, but and maybe maybe optimistic is not exactly the right word. But I will say this. Israel has has enjoyed for decades, since it emerged, impunity in the international legal system, and as I said, it has enjoyed an exceptional status, right, in many other ways, including in Holocaust and genocide status. Now we have an unprecedented genocidal assault, right? And that's why I insist on my formulation from that Jewish Currents article on 13th of October, a textbook case. I think it is indeed a textbook case of genocide. And but one of the things that this has done, it has really crossed all kind of conceivable red lines, right? So it has made it now impossible, basically, right, to continue to maintain this facade, right, that enabled Israel impunity and Israel exceptionalism, right? As long as we were talking about this kind of what's called actually in scholarship on colonial and settler colonial violence, slow violence, right? As long as we were in the realm of slow violence, which was actually very, very vicious and very violent, right? But it still, made it possible to hold up this facade, right, and maintain Israel impunity. It was still very absurd, right? But it was still possible. Now it's not possible. anymore, right? There is no going back to before 7th of October, right? Now, let's just think about this. The South African application to the International Court of Justice isn't, whatever happens this week and in the coming month, and most likely by early February, certainly before the beginning of the new judges of the court on 6th of February. So within several weeks, we'll know what the decision is about the provisional measures, the request in the application for provisional measures. But whatever happens, even if the court rejects the request for provisional measures, the South African application is already unprecedented, right? It has already brought Israel to the World Court on accusations of genocide, right? This is a watershed moment. It's also highly, who knows what can happen. It's also highly unlikely that the court will not order at least some of the provisional measures, right? And any provisional measure that it order will again be unprecedented, right? It'll also have unbelievable implication in the international realm. Think about what it will do, for example, for Israel's allies, primarily the United States, right? So if you just think about this, the ICJ case that's now ongoing, right? We see, again, I'm not sure that again, where millions of people have lost their worlds, have experienced tremendous violence and trauma that will last for generations, which is what genocide does. And the loss is, none of this can ever. There's genocide. It's final, right? So this should be, I think, highlighted. But this is a watershed moment, right? And it could lead to. It's very difficult actually to predict what will happen because of its unprecedented nature. But because of its unprecedented nature of the Israeli assault on Gaza, we might also be seeing some unprecedented changes.
Great, thank you. We have about 35 minutes or so for questions from the audience, and the standard rules apply. No lectures, no long speeches. Keep your questions as short as possible, and I'll ask Raz to keep your answers as short as possible so we can get to as many people as possible and try and wrap things up by 8 o'clock, largely because I haven't had dinner yet, so I have a personal incentive in ending on time. So, Nigar, first question.
All right. Real quick, before I hand it off to you, if you have not read Dr. Segal's Jewish Currents article, Google it, do yourself the favor. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nader, for a great event, and thanks to Professor Segal. Can you elaborate more on why you think there is this impunity for Israel, both from a political viewpoint, so this global impunity they have in the global space? Is it the Security Council veto provided by the United States constantly? Is it guilt by European perpetrators of Holocaust? Is it the war of information? I'm a journalist. I think this is very much a war of information propaganda as it is an actual conventional war on the ground. Is it sort of the framing? Is it the lack of awareness or understanding? If you can elaborate more on the reasons, and also from a scholar viewpoint, why do they enjoy this impunity in the academic world? And this may be a question for both of you, since you're both in the academia. I feel like the tide is turning. There is a change in rhetoric, and we see that at the forefront in college campuses. Now, the Israel lobby has resorted to literally banning, censorship, doxing of college students to try to prevent this change of rhetoric that we're seeing in college campuses. Do you think policy, especially here in the U.S., is going to catch up to that change in rhetoric, or is it going to be, business as usual? Because Congress and this Democratic administration doesn't seem to be much affected, but college campuses are a different world.
Do you want to maybe collect some questions?
Actually, we'll do one-on-one, and then as we get closer to 8 o'clock, we'll do like 3 questions, and let's do that.
Sure, okay. So impunity, and again, I'll try to be very, very brief because there's so much to say about this. this. But it's basically rooted in the idea of Jewish exceptionalism, okay? What do I mean? Let's just take the international legal system, okay? So the international legal system emerges after World War II, and it has a key innovation to it, which is the crime of genocide, okay? The crime of genocide has its clear historical context, right? Near historical context, the Holocaust, okay? Now, the Holocaust, again, the convention, the language of Article 2 in the convention is very different, but in the kind of discourse that's created around it, also in the international legal discourse, the Holocaust needs to be made unique, right? Exceptional. Why? Primarily in order to differentiate it completely from colonial genocides, right? Okay, so the Holocaust is unique. Now, the Holocaust is unique. Jews are also unique in this framework, and it's very important to say that the Nazis saw Jews as unique in the Judeo-Christian world that they wanted to destroy in order to create a Nazi world, right? So after World War II, the reemergence of the international legal system takes this Nazi view and turns it on its head and reestablishes the uniqueness of Jews in the Judeo-Christian Western world in a positive way, right? So the Holocaust is unique, Jews are unique, and then of course the Jewish state, Israel, that is created in 1948 when the UN Genocide Convention is also passed in December 1948, so several months after the establishment of Israel. Israel, the Jewish state, right, in this way is also unique, right? Also because it's a Jewish state, but also because it's a state of the survivors, right? And indeed, a lot of Holocaust survivors, for various reasons, arrive in Israel, right? So the Holocaust, Jews, Israel exceptionalism here is very, very important because in the international legal framework, the idea that Israel, from the very beginning, can perpetrate actually any crime, right? Certainly the crime of genocide becomes unimaginable and unspeakable. Impunity is actually discursively baked into the system from the very beginning, right? And it's based on this idea of Jewish exceptionalism. Now there's another thing going on here, right? I mean, this immediately serves to distort and the Nakba itself, right? The foundational crime of the Jewish state, the Nakba. But why is it so important also to distort and to maintain this Holocaust, Jews, Israel exceptionality? In order to not talk about Israel as a settler colonial project, a late settler colonial project, right? Why? Because then, of course, and this is why the impunity persists until today and touches also on what you asked about what's happening now in college campuses and the kind of changes that we might see or not see, right? Because if we finally, and now I think we might be in this watershed moment, recognize Israel for what it is, a settler colonial project, then we also have to finally recognize what the US is, what Canada is, what Australia is. We also have to recognize, these settler colonial projects, right? The genocidal violence, right, in these settler colonial projects, and that's, of course, so the Holocaust needs to be exceptional and unique in order not to do that. So the whole framework, right, of Jewish exceptionalism, of Israel impunity, also it distorts the Nakba, it creates impunity, but it also makes it very difficult, right, to talk about reality, right? It's very important to say that the post-1967 settler project, right, after the Six-Day War, the people who were sent to settle in the occupied territories are called in Hebrew mitnachlim, which is literally settlers. You can use other words in Hebrew, right? But they're called mitnachlim in Hebrew. This is, I mean, the way that reality is denied, right, is very important, but it's really based on this kind of Jewish exceptionalism. Campuses.
You want to say something about that?
Do you
No, you go ahead.
So I mean again, I don't know. I don't want to make any predictions. I don't know what will happen in in campuses, right? What I do know is that the weaponization of the discourse around anti-Semitism, so the presentation of all critique of Israel, right, as anti-Semitism, which is, of course, part of the weaponization, the screwed weaponization that I mentioned of presenting Palestinians as Nazis, right? It's all part of the same kind of discursive mechanism. Did not begin, obviously, on 7th of October, right? This is ongoing for a long time. It has to do with the IRA definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is this big project of weaponizing anti-Semitism in order to shut down critique of Israel, in order to portray Palestinians and activists in support of Palestinians as really anti-Semitism, right? So we can't talk about the critique anymore because this is really anti-Semitism, right? And again, it's based on this idea of Holocaust, Jews, Israel exceptionalism, right? This thing. It's very powerful, right? And we're already seeing its effects at Harvard and Penn with the forced resignations of 2 university presidents as a direct effect of this discourse, right? And of course it's horrific because the discourse is promoted, right, by people who are really anti-Semitic, right? So I don't, you know, it's very difficult to, as I said, we're in an unprecedented moment, right? And there's also a clear divide between the political class in this country and the streets, right? I mean, it's becoming more and more clear that the political class, left, right, center, whatever it is, doesn't represent anymore large parts of the population, right? So the same can be said about, you know, senior administrators in universities around this country and the campus itself. It's unclear how this will unfold. There's way too many moving pieces, but we are in this unprecedented watershed moment. So, you know.
I mean, your answer on impunity and immunity with respect to this topic reminded me exactly what's happening in Germany today, where in many ways Germany is sort of the has embodied this type of sort of discourse where we simply can't evaluate Israeli state behavior for what it's doing in Gaza because of this exceptional sort of position it holds within the German sort of political culture and its mindset.
I'll just say, and then we'll move on, that of course Germany also highlights for us how thinking about Jewish exceptionalism, right, that Israel is somehow exceptional, right, is rooted itself in a continued anti-Semitic mindset, right? This is very important to mention. Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry, folks.
Do you have someone? Okay, go ahead.
I have the mind.
Go ahead.
Very quickly, you talked about this being a watershed moment. There's some voices like Peter Weinhardt, other American Jews, Katie Halbert, who don't use the word genocide for fear of getting sympathetic and rational voices within Israel to talk about a post-event settlement. What are your views of that? Are there downsides or dangers of using genocide because and by implication, U.S. stand on it as being counterproductive to whatever settlement comes afterwards? Thanks.
That's our Canadian contribution for tonight. I'm Dalit Kayyum. It's a discussion I've been having with people like Peter Weinhardt, who's been very important in this country in terms of thinking through this issue, does not or has not used the term genocide because I think he's doing it because it alienates people. It's too much of a charge, particularly among segments of the American Jewish community. And it's not constructive to sort of doing exactly what Dalit said. So I guess just to put a finer point on it, what's the utility and the setbacks of using that term in the context of trying to mobilize people in this country around a just resolution of Israel-Palestine?
You know, I'll first say that I'm very old school, actually, in the way that I think about truth. And if something fits, and you know, and if there's a reality in front of our eyes, and this is so in our face, as I outlined, right? Then I think we should stick to the truth, right? And if we have international crime of genocide, and it's outlined in international law in a way that now what Israel is doing is textbook genocide, then that's what we should be talking about. So that's the first way I'll answer this. But the second way I'll answer this is that it's exactly the other way around, actually, right? In terms of how to think moving forward, perhaps about a future beyond this, right? It's very difficult to imagine it at this point, right? Just to stop the violence, right, has become very difficult to imagine. But let me put it this way: the Holocaust and genocide studies, the field, but the Holocaust genocide framework, right, has worked, right, to maintain a situation where Israel could perpetrate various mass violence, violate international law with impunity, right? So the Holocaust genocide, the concepts, right, are part of a political and legal system that has brought us to this situation, right? But now, interestingly, so the concept of genocide until now has actually worked, right, to provide Israel the kind of impunity that allowed its violence to escalate and positions in Israel to become more and more extreme, and so on and so forth. Now, because, as I said, Israel has gone, has crossed all the kind of red lines, right, has broken all the rules, has indeed violated international law in such a stark way that now the concept of genocide works exactly in the opposite way, right? It actually enables us finally to hold Israel to account, right, for what it is doing. It opens a window now, actually, to think about accountability, also to talk, indeed, truthfully about Israeli history, right? I want to remind everyone, Israel is a society where there is a Nakba law, right? Talking about the Nakba in Israel is criminalized, right? A memory law. It's not anything unique. There's memory laws in Poland and Ukraine and Russia, right? It's not, so it's also an opportunity to talk truthfully about Israeli history, and only if there's accountability and truth, right, and hopefully also justice, right, then we can reimagine a future beyond this. How can it happen otherwise? So insisting on genocide actually is a way forward, and it also matches reality. So I see no problem with it whatsoever.
Lori, do you have another question? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Back.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for coming out. Is it all clear? Okay.
Yeah, speak closer to the microphone because we can barely hear you.
All right. Thank you very much for coming out. Actually, my question surrounds, as you said, like Israeli society appears very militarized, like handing out weapons, and there was the whole large segments of the population supporting what would effectively be genocidal positions. Now, from your study of genocide history, have there been examples of a general society shifting away from these extremist positions? And if so, what are the conditions that would enable such a radical shift, ideally, without violence? I can only think of one example, and that's not ideal. So what would you, what kind of...
What example are you thinking about?
Well, I mean, World War II, right? Like, there was a very extreme society, there was an entire process that was effectively forced on a population, and is there a way to, more peacefully move things forward and reconciliation?
Yeah, that's a great question. What are the social conditions that can sort of change a society that seems to be in favor of extreme mass violence to, I guess, reorient the political culture of that society in ways that would enhance some sort of political settlement?
Yeah, I'm not very optimistic on that in the short term, but I'll tell you, I will give you, so I think there's only one way, actually, in which I can see a shift. Your question is very good because you are concentrating on the social level, right, on how people feel and think. And this is the dehumanization of Palestinians in Israeli politics and society did not begin on the 7th of October. I mean, in 2009, there were T-shirts that Israeli army units printed, right, with images, for example, of pregnant Palestinian women, right, with target on it, right, and there was the text was 1 shot, 2 down, right? These kinds of things. So, and of course, when I was growing up in Israel, by the way, dirty Arab, right? Dirty Arab, very common. right? So the social aspect is very important. How do you deal with it? It takes a long time, and arguably you can say Nazi Germany was defeated, right? But a lot of entrenched racism and anti-Semitism in German society, you know, persisted until today, right? We can see this very clearly when we look at Germany today. But let me give you my take on this. So I think there's only one way when we can see change, right? Is that the idea, Israelis are very attached to the idea that their security is tied to the oppression of Palestinians, okay? Now, this has proven to be wrong, right? Their security, the oppression of Palestinians makes them insecure, right? The only way that I can see change is the start of a process where Israelis will understand that their security is depending on the security of Palestinians. And that therefore we need actually equality and security for all and dignity for all and these kinds of things. Not because, right, they stop one day suddenly. It doesn't happen like that, right? Entrenched racism and white supremacy doesn't go away in one day, right? But the process might start with this understanding, right, that is also attached to the 7th of October, right, that Jews' security is bound to Palestinian security, right?
So just to push you on that, if there was a better or more just or more forward-looking U.S. foreign policy toward Israel, sending a message that Israel can't continue in this way and enjoy unconditional American support in terms of, you know, military support, economic support, political support, and there was an attempt to establish consequences for Israel in terms of its behavior by its biggest backer, the United States, would that not force the type of political change that the question was suggesting might happen? Would that be a significant enough development to start to change Israeli political culture in terms of how they view the Palestinians, knowing that their biggest backer is no longer going to be, you know, supporting them without conditions?
I'm not sure about that. If you think about the social element, right? I think that people really need to understand, and we need to think about it. There are tens of thousands of Israelis today who are displaced from their home. Israelis, right? Israelis today definitely feel that they are insecure, right? So I do think actually that this process has now begun, right? Of understanding this issue of security. It'll take a long time until it really translates, right, into this ideas of equality and dignity, and right. But this is where I think the change has actually started.
Next question, Lori. Lori has the microphone. Okay, go ahead. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So my concern is that because South Africa is participating in this new anti-Western coalition with Russia, China, Iran, and others, I can't remember the exact name of it, Brazil. I'm concerned that because South Africa brought this to the international court, that the U.S. Propaganda system or any Western Israeli propaganda system can totally undermine who brought it, and therefore the whole thing falls apart. Because the public, we don't get information about, oh, what's the latest issue going before the international court? We hear about the Supreme Court. We don't have any cultural understanding of any authority over there. So I'm concerned about that easy way to just discount the whole thing and wash it away, even though what you've said makes complete sense. It's completely accurate.
So, you know, I don't think that this kind of diplomatic international game is going to work in this case, because as I said, the fact that the application happened and that the case is going to be heard, right, the initial hearings this week, right, is already unprecedented, right? So whatever smearing of South Africa in this case happens is not going to matter. Again, also because the issue really is not so much South Africa, right? The issue really is the unprecedented genocidal assault, Israeli genocidal assault on Gaza, right? Yes, there will be, I mean, yes, Israel's initial response was that this is a blood libel, right? So again, the weaponization of anti-Semitism immediately, right? But it's not working, right? It's not working. You know how we know that it's not working? This is the first time that Israel recognizes an international legal process against it, right? And decides to respond officially. It's not working, right?
Next question. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. So if we assume the premise that Israel has a right to exist, how do you think Israel should have reacted on October 7th? And how do you think Israel should continue from this point forward?
So I think that all the people under Israeli control, right, have a right, should enjoy all the rights that everyone that only some of the people enjoy. Okay, so moving forward, right? These questions about how to move forward. Moving forward can't be with occupation. It can't be with siege. It can't be with oppression. It can't be with a basic law that designates not only the million people under occupation that have been living for decades without any kind of rights, basic rights, but the citizens, the almost 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel themselves, a basic law of the state, right, relegates to second-class citizens, right? So moving forward, I think that the 7 million Jews and the 7 million Palestinians, right, who live between the river and the sea, all should have equality, dignity, their security should be respected. That should be the vision of moving forward, right? How should have Israel responded? So I think that a state has an absolute right to repel such attacks against it, without a doubt, right? A state has no right, right, to respond to such attacks with genocide. Genocide is an illegal response in international law, right? That's international law. So as long as we recognize, as I tried to lay out here, right, that we're talking about a case of genocide, it is illegitimate, it is illegal, right? That's clear. Did it have a right to stop the attack on 7th of October, to repel that attack? Absolutely. And it's also important then to say, in terms of what else could a state do, right? That Israel brings out this argument about self-defense, right? It's important to say that self-defense in international law doesn't apply in occupied territory. And if we recognize Gaza as, even after the withdrawal of Israeli troops and the withdrawal of Israeli settlements from Gaza in 2005 as occupied territory, because Israel continued to control, right, everything that comes in and out, all the borders, the sea border. Israel was in a position to decide how many calories Palestinians will eat, right? Gaza was under a 16-year siege before the 7th of October, which is the reason that Israel could proclaim a total siege on it on 9th of October, right? This is the longest siege in modern history, by the way, right? Self-defense doesn't apply in occupied territory. That's just international law. So yes, repelling the attack within its territory, absolutely. Ensuring the security of its citizens, absolutely. Responding with genocide, absolutely not. Moving forward with occupation and siege, absolutely not.
We've got 10 minutes left, and so let's take 3 questions back to back, keep them short, and if we have time, we'll go for maybe one more round. So first question.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. As a Palestinian, it means a lot to me to hear you say all of these things. I think one thing that I've been suffering from recently is finding hope in Israeli society and the Israeli individual. Because you talk a lot about our dehumanization, but for someone like myself, I try very hard to humanize you because I do not want to be hateful. And I do not want to see 23,000 dead Israelis and feel nothing. The way that Israeli society reacts right now. But then I look at the other side and ask myself the question, I don't want our rights to be achieved as a means of security for Israelis. I want it to be something where they recognize that I too am a human being and I have suffered just as their ancestors have. I think that's when reconciliation can start. So my question to you is there hope that that could happen? What needs to happen for that to be real? And what within Israeli society can be done? Because I know there's voices of reason, such as yourself, Gideon Levy. I've been watching a lot of these people's more so than Palestinian voices, because I want to see the other side as trying to reach out. So my question to you is there hope? How long would it take? And how can we work with these individuals to bring about that future?
Okay, second question, thank you for that. Second question, where's the microphone?
Dr. Hashemi, do you mind if we actually have that one be one singular and then we do?
Sure, okay, we'll do it that way. Just answer that question.
Okay. So, you know, I'll just say this. There are people in Israeli society today, they're a minority, but they're a significant minority, who continue to insist and to struggle on a joint Jewish-Palestinian
We're all good.
Okay, I think we're good. We'll keep going, yeah.
There are people in Israeli society who will continue to insist and to struggle for a joint and a shared Jewish, Israeli-Palestinian life and future there. In some sense, it has actually accelerated. Actually, after 7th of October, again, it's small groups, and then themselves are under attack today in Israeli politics and society. But in a way, they've been strengthened also in their mission and their work. But you know, again, my sense is that it's going to take a long time. Yeah, my sense is it's going to take a long time, and I think that I do think, though, you know, and I want to say also in response to the previous question, together with this, that, you know, when it'll take a long time. It'll be a process. It does. I think it will. It's inevitable. I agree with you completely that it's very, very far from ideal, right? But it's only when the hegemonic society there of Jews understand that their future security, right, is depending on this different kind of future, that decades of occupation and decades of mass violence have not worked, have not actually brought them security, right? That will push this process forward. I agree with you that this is very, very far from ideal, but again, I also want to emphasize that there are groups in Israel, they've been working for a long time, and they've continued to work after 7th of October, and in a way even been strengthened, right, with Palestinians about a shared and joint Jewish-Palestinian future.
Let's take 3 quick questions. Yeah.
My name's Ann Wright. I resigned from the State Department over the Iraq War 20 years ago. And this State Department leadership sucks. That's about all I can say. But, okay, so we get a genocide convention and ratification of it in the Court of Justice. What the hell happens after that? Who's going to take on the Israelis to get the genocide stopped? How does that happen? I mean, so far it's been the Houthis and it's been Hezbollah, the only ones that have responded at all to the genocide. Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you for your reminder and the discussion of the weaponization of Jewish theology with the Amalek reference, but I think that it doesn't really, that phenomenon is not limited to the Amalek reference. More recently I was reading that the rabbi that has now been placed in charge of military ethics is the same rabbi who suggested that it is permissible for soldiers to rape Gentiles on an as-needed basis. So I wonder if you can comment a bit on how we can push back against the weaponization of an insidious theology.
Last question.
Thank you, Molly. Downtown. We're getting there, folks.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering if you might comment on how you see, considering how integral the notion of Jewish exceptionalism, Jewish state exceptionalism is to like this post-World War II liberal order. How do you see that coming apart in this moment, maybe?
Thank you. Raz, take any of those questions or all of the questions, and you've got 3 minutes. But take a bit longer.
You know, I'll just say this, maybe mostly in response to the second question. I think it's important to insist on undoing a conflation that's been intentional from the very beginning of the Israeli state between a people and a state, right? Jews, the people, and a state, Israel, right? So, of course, the Jewish state, but of course, 21% of its citizens, as we said, are Palestinians today. And in any case, a state and a people are not the same kind of thing. And of course, this conflation, right, of a state and a people, and the kind of role that Israel has taken as claimed, right, of speaking on behalf of all Jews and acting on behalf of all Jews in the world, and you know, distorts, right, the way that there were and are very many anti-Zionist Jews, non-Zionist Jews, right? There's also this identity, by the way, non-Zionist Jews. The people are not anti, are not pro, they're Jews, right? Their lives are not primarily about a state, right? That state, right? They're citizens of other states. So there's, I think that insisting on disentangling or undoing this conflation of a people and a state is very important also to think about issues of Jewish exceptionalism, about this weaponization that we're seeing in various realms, in general about discussions about Israel and Israeli state violence and now Israeli genocide, and maybe even it will help, you know, in who will take on. I think that the ICJ case has much more significance than you might be imagining at this point. I agree that there's a lot of real political.
Well, please join me in thanking Raz Segal for being with us tonight. Thank you to Busboys and Poets for hosting us. This is the first of several lecture series. I have to make sure that Raz gets some rest tonight and gets some dinner because he has to lecture tomorrow at Georgetown. But I think he's willing to stay behind for a few minutes to chat with people before you have to head out. Okay, so thank you all for coming. Thanks again.
Let's give him another round of applause.